First, we've got the Brachioradialis. This is one of my all-time favorite muscles. When I was in college, we used to call this muscle the beer drinker's muscle, because of what it does when it contracts. Now, if this seems too offensive, feel free to change the name to something like the soda drinker's muscle or the coffee drinker's muscle. The brachioradialis attaches to two bones, the humerus and the radius. Specifically, the brachioradialis originates from the lateral supracondylar ridge, which is a ridge of bone just proximal to the lateral epicondyle. It inserts onto the styloid process of the radius, also known as the radial styloid process, or radial styloid. It crosses the elbow joint and acts to flex the forearm at the elbow. However, it performs two opposing actions. If the hand is positioned in a pronated position, the brachioradialis will supinate it. Conversely, if the hand is positioned in a supinated position, the brachioradialis will pronate it. In performing both pronation and supination, the brachioradialis will position the hand so that the thumb is up. Then, after it positions the hand with the thumb up, it will flex the elbow, lending to its nickname. The brachioradialis is innervated by the radial nerve. It should be noted that even though this is an elbow flexor, it's still innervated by the radial nerve, a nerve that's usually known for innervating extensors. And finally, the brachioradialis receives its blood supply from the same arteries as the brachialis, the radial-collateral artery and the radial-recurrent artery. The next muscle we'll look at is the extensor carpi radialis longus. It has a little buddy it sits with, the extensor carpi radialis brevis. Together they're similar to flexor carpi radialis on the front of the forearm. Extensor carpi radialis longus attaches to the humerus in the hand. Specifically, this muscle originates from the lateral supracondylar ridge, a ridge just above or proximal to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Do you remember what other muscle came from here? The brachioradialis. The extensor carpi radialis longus has a long, thin tendon that passes down the forearm and inserts onto the posterior base of the second metacarpal. When it contracts, the extensor carpi radialis longus will extend at the wrist and radially deviate the hand at the wrist. It's innervated by the radial nerve and receives its blood supply from branches of the brachial and radial arteries. The extensor carpi radialis longus's little buddy, the extensor carpi radialis brevis, sits right next to it. It also attaches to the humerus in the hand. Specifically, the extensor carpi radialis brevis originates from a spot just distal to the origin of the longus, that being the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It inserts onto the posterior base of the third metacarpal. Just like its buddy the longus, when it contracts, the extensor carpi radialis brevis acts to extend and radially deviate the hand at the wrist. As mentioned before, extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis are very similar to flexor carpi radialis in that they both attach to the second and third metacarpals and they radially deviate the hand at the wrist. The difference, however, is that the muscles with extensor in the name are on the back of the forearm, and the muscle with flexor in the name is on the front of the forearm. The extensor carpi radialis brevis is innervated by the posterior interosseous nerve, which is a branch of the radial nerve. It receives its blood supply from the same vessels as the longus, namely branches of the brachial and radial arteries. Extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, along with the brachioradialis, are sometimes called the wad of three by some anatomists. It's simply a group of forearm muscles associated with the radius. They all originate one right after the other from the humerus, specifically the lateral supracondylar ridge and the lateral epicondyle. From proximal to distal, they originate as follows: brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Often, when we're looking for the supinator muscle on dissection, we grab this wad of three as a whole and move it aside. When we do this, it helps us to see the supinator better. Extensor digitorum, commonly called the extensor digitorum communis, is the main extensor of the fingers located in the forearm. It attaches to the humerus in the fingers. Specifically, it originates from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It runs down the back of the forearm as it divides into its 4 tendons. The tendons pass under the extensor retinaculum, and distally, the tendons will expand to form the dorsal digital expansions. These dorsal digital expansions will cover the proximal phalanx like a hood, and attach to the posterior surfaces of the middle and distal phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. As the name implies, when this muscle contracts, it acts to extend the fingers or extend the digits. It'll also extend the hand at the wrist if it contracts forcefully enough. Extensor digitorum is innervated by the posterior interosseous nerve, which is a branch of the radial nerve. It receives its blood supply from the posterior interosseous artery. The extensor carpi ulnaris is located right next to the ulna bone. In fact, the ulna is positioned between the extensor carpi ulnaris and the flexor carpi ulnaris. You can find the ulna and then find the muscles. One's on the flexor side and the other's on the extensor side. The extensor carpi ulnaris attaches to the humerus, ulna, and hand. Specifically, it originates from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and shaft of the ulna. It then reaches down and attaches to the posterior base of the 5th metacarpal, similar to its flexor counterpart, the flexor carpi ulnaris. When it contracts, the extensor carpi ulnaris extends the hand at the wrist and ulnar deviates the hand at the wrist. It's innervated by the posterior interosseous nerve, which is a branch of the radial nerve. You would think it would be innervated by the ulnar nerve, but that's not the case here. Remember, flexor carpi ulnaris is innervated by the ulnar nerve, but not extensor carpi ulnaris. It receives its blood supply from the posterior interosseous artery, which is a branch of the ulnar artery. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider clicking like and subscribing to my channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications to get alerted to all my latest videos. For more helpful anatomy and physiology study resources, visit www.humanbodyhelp.com.